Pride and Prejudice. The £10 note. I don't know when you last held a £10 note in your hand, the note that celebrates Jane Austen. I've got one here. In the centre there's a large picture of Jane Austen's face, and there are two small pictures next to it. One is a great house, a stately home that belonged to a brother of Jane Austen, and the other is a picture of a woman seated at a desk, taken from an artist's illustration of the heroine of Pride and Prejudice, Elizabeth Bennet, reading letters from her sister Jane. And below Jane Austen's face, in very small letters, is a quotation from Pride and Prejudice, which is, "I declare, after all, there is no enjoyment like reading." It's this quotation that I want to consider in my video. The sentence on the banknote, "I declare, after all, there is no enjoyment like reading," is spoken by Caroline Bingley, a snobbish, superficial young woman who's just been watching the hero of the novel, Mr. Darcy, whom she fancies and wants to impress, reading a book. She's tried in vain to get his attention by inquiring about his reading and attempting to look at the page he's on, and she's even done the utterly stupid thing of starting to read the second volume of his book in a ridiculous attempt, and she hasn't read the first volume, in a ridiculous attempt to show that she shares his elevated taste in literature. It's blatantly clear that she's taking no interest in her book at all, as demonstrated in the following passage, which includes the declaration on the £10 note. At length, quite exhausted by the attempt to be amused with her own book, she gave a great yawn and said, "How pleasant it is to spend an evening in this way. I declare, after all, there is no enjoyment like reading. How much sooner one tires of anything than of a book. When I have a house of my own, I shall be miserable if I have not an excellent library." No one made any reply. She then yawned again, threw aside her book, and cast her eyes round the room in quest of some amusement. Now, I hope you're entertained by Caroline Bingley's stupid and showy boastfulness about her supposed delight in reading, when she obviously has no concern for it whatsoever. By the way, her reference to having an excellent library when she has a house of her own is a crass hint of her romantic inclinations towards Darcy, who has a magnificent library at his house, Pemberley. If you've been pleasantly amused by this portrayal of Caroline Bingley, you'll have reacted just as Jane Austen wanted you to do. But Jane Austen wasn't to know that the Bank of England would provide later generations with another pleasure, that of smiling or even laughing at the stupidity of the Bank of England in quoting Caroline Bingley totally out of context, supposedly to justify the enjoyment in reading that Jane Austen or a lover of Jane Austen would have, whereas in fact it does no such thing. When Caroline Bingley shows herself to be so silly and pompously declaring that reading beats all other pleasures, she's speaking to a company of 4 other people. These are the hero of the novel, Darcy, the heroine of the novel, Lizzie, Elizabeth Bennet, along with Caroline's married sister and this sister's husband. I'm now going to give you 2 more mentions of reading from this part of Pride and Prejudice, where the company of people I've just mentioned are assembled. The first one comes a little earlier than the words of Caroline Bingley on the £10 note, and helps to explain why she feels the need to impress the handsome and rich Mr. Darcy. In a conversation about the qualities needed to make up the truly accomplished woman, various things are mentioned, such as being proficient in music, modern languages, dancing and drawing, and Darcy completes the list by making the following remark. "All this she must possess. And to all this, she must yet add something more substantial in the improvement of her mind by extensive reading. Of course, if there's one thing that Caroline Bingley does not possess, despite all her elegance, her splendid dancing, her proficiency in music, one thing she does not possess is a mind that has been improved by extensive reading. And her remark quoted on the £10 note is her desperate attempt to prove that she truly is a keen reader, but uttered in a context that laughably shows her to be the very opposite of this. But if Caroline Bingley fails to be the ideal young lady with regard to what Darcy calls extensive reading, can the heroine of the novel, Lizzie Bennet, be said to pass Darcy's test? The answer is given in another mention of reading taken from this part of Pride and Prejudice. In fact, it comes only a little while before the one I've just dealt with. There are 3 speakers involved here. The first is Mr. Hurst, the husband of Caroline's sister, an idle person who's interested in nothing except playing cards and eating fine food. The second speaker is Caroline Bingley, and the third is Lizzie Bennet. The context of the dialogue is that Lizzie Bennet has just come downstairs into the drawing room where she finds a game of cards is in progress, but she declines to play as she believes they are playing high, betting sums of money on the game that are more than she's prepared to risk. And so she says she'll sit and amuse herself with a book instead. I'm going to give you what now happens, beginning with Mr. Hurst's remark and following this with the words of Caroline Bingley and Lizzie herself. Mr. Hurst looked at Elizabeth with astonishment. "Do you prefer reading to cards?" said he. "That is rather singular." "Miss Eliza Bennet," said Miss Bingley, "despises cards. She is a great reader and has no pleasure in anything else." "I deserve neither such praise nor such censure," cried Elizabeth. "I am not a great reader, and I have pleasure in many things." Mr. Hurst's amazement about someone apparently preferring reading to playing cards instantly marks him as a shallow, trivial figure, vastly inferior in character to Darcy. But it's what follows his remark that's particularly interesting. Caroline Bingley at this point has not yet decided to put on her show of being the intellectual type of woman that she believes will impress Darcy, and so she takes quite a different tack in sneering at Lizzie for supposedly putting on airs as a snobbish bookworm. Lizzie's reply is a perfect rejoinder, instantly rejecting the charge of looking down her nose at non-intellectual pleasures such as cards, but at the same time being totally honest about her own interest in reading. As she says, "I am not," and the word "not" is italicised in the text for emphasis, "I'm not a great reader." If we come back to Darcy's words about the perfectly accomplished woman, we can take Lizzie's honest confession about her reading as an indication that she would not necessarily pass Darcy's test. She does read, but not extensively. Jane Austen here is showing us the normal and reasonable talents and inclinations of an actual human being, as opposed to an idealised one, Darcy's ideal accomplished woman, or one who pretends to abilities and interests she does not have, Caroline Bingley in her declaration on the £10 note. And as for that £10 note, I've one last thing to say. Yes, I have been very critical of the Bank of England's choice of quotation from Pride and Prejudice, but what sentence from this most popular of Jane Austen's novels would I have chosen to quote on the banknote instead? Well, my first response is to say that I wouldn't willingly choose to quote at all, simply because to pluck a single sentence out of context incurs the danger of loss or distortion of meaning. However, if I were compelled, at gunpoint say, to choose a sentence to go on the banknote, it would be one particular terse, striking sentence that comes at almost exactly halfway through Pride and Prejudice. A sentence that marks a moment of vital importance in the novel and is also connected with reading. I'll explain. At the heart of Pride and Prejudice, the heroine, Lizzie Bennet, changes her mind about the hero, Darcy. This change of mind comes as the result of reading a letter that has been written to her by Darcy in order to vindicate himself after Lizzie has mercilessly condemned his behaviour and character in the course of utterly rejecting his marriage proposal to her. Lizzie has to force herself to read Darcy's letter that she receives the next day, force herself to encounter arguments and evidence that run completely counter to her existing prejudices, force herself to recognise her own improper pride in being so sure that her own view of things is the only possible one to have. Reading the letter is a deeply painful experience for her, the complete opposite of the word enjoyment that Caroline used to describe reading. But in a sense, close to what Darcy said when he talked about reading as improving the mind. And this improvement has been of the most striking, radical kind, by causing Lizzie to reevaluate not only her view of others, but also her own judgment and her own fundamental character. Lizzie Bennet will not be the same person after reading the letter, and the whole novel will change direction after it. To give you then my choice of sentence to be quoted from Pride and Prejudice on the £10 note, I'll read you some of the words leading up to the relevant sentence, ending with the short telling sentence itself, which I'll repeat to conclude my talk. The words are Lizzie's thoughts spoken aloud to herself when she's finished reading Darcy's letter. How despicably have I acted! I, who've prided myself on my discernment. I, who've valued myself on my abilities. How humiliating is this discovery! I could not have been more wretchedly blind. I have courted prepossession and ignorance and driven reason away. Till this moment, I never knew myself. Till this moment, I never knew myself. Thank you for listening.